Call the meeting to order. This meeting of June 21st. Note that all commissioners are present. First item of business is the order of business. Are there any changes or modifications to the order of business? Hearing none, would there be a motion to approve it?
So moved.
Motion moved by Mr. Steiner, a second by Mr. Jackson. Any discussion? Hearing none, then all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. The motion carries. Next item business then is the consent agenda. Are there any items on the consent agenda you wish to discuss? Hearing none, would there be a motion then to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have the motion and the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Landblom?
Aye.
Mr. Holtmans?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. We'll move to the non-timetable agenda. First item there is to hear the May financial report. So, Mrs. Johnson.
Mr. President, Commissioners, I would like to highlight a few items from the financial report through May. Over the last few months, we have updated both the financial report and the presentation. The general fund report now subtotals both revenues and expenses into major groups. The details of each group are shown on the financial report that you received and on the slides. There's a separate report for the general fund, for the enterprise funds, the sales tax funds, and so on, which correspond to how the slides are presented. If there's a particular item you as a commissioner would like to see added, please let me know. We'll begin with the general fund report. With 42% of the year completed, our property taxes equal $2,885,000, and we're 96% collected compared to budget. Our other taxes and fees was 50% collected compared to budget. This includes the financial institution tax, which is 50% less than last year. This tax revenue is based on banking income, which saw a significant decline during the national financial crisis. Our intergovernmental includes revenues that we receive from state and local governments, like highway distribution tax and oil production. This line is 24% collected compared to budget. Our licenses, fees, and services includes building permit revenue and oil royalties, and is 37% collected compared to budget. Our sales of city lots and equipment is shown separately due to the amount of activity that is occurring this year. This line item is 12% more than last year at this time. Our other revenues include interest earned and miscellaneous items, and our transfers in are revenues from other funds throughout the city. Our total general fund revenues equal $4,410,000 through May, and we're 56% collected compared to budget.
Mrs. Johnson, on the financial institution tax, then, you have it all.
We have received it all.
Okay,
Yes.
so we are going to have a shortfall there then.
Yes, they do expect that to rebound next year.
Okay.
Our general fund expenses through May are broken down by groups. They include general government, which includes administration, municipal court, finance, IT, assessing, and buildings and grounds, and is 44% expended compared to budget. Our public safety includes police and fire, and is 42% expended compared to budget. Engineering and streets is 41% expended compared to budget. Cultural services include the museum and forestry, and is 30% expended compared to budget. Our contingency and reserve includes a $65,000 contingency line item and the West River Community Center major maintenance reserve. And our transfers out are transfers to other funds within the city. Our total general fund expenses equal $3,427,000 through May, and we're 44% expended compared to budget. In our enterprise funds, our total enterprise fund revenue equals $2,634,000 through May, and we're 37% collected compared to budget. And our total enterprise fund expenses equals $2,344,000 through May, and we're 35% expended compared to budget. There were fee increases in both the wastewater and the solid waste funds on January 1st to help alleviate a negative cash balance in both of these funds. In our sales tax reports, the 1% sales tax fund shows we received $175,000 of tax revenue in May, which is up 8.7% for the year. This slide also shows the sales tax refund that was paid to the state due to an overpayment of local taxes by a single taxpayer. The overpayments extended over a 3-year period, with the bulk of the overpayment received in December of 2008. Although we are not able to restate our previously audited financial statements, I have adjusted the spreadsheet on page 14 of the report to better reflect the period that was actually affected. Our 0.5% sales tax, we received $87,000 of tax revenue in May, which is also up 8.7% for the year. Our expenses include $256,000 paid towards the West River Community Center bond. The sales tax refund line item that's shown here is also due to the overpayment of local taxes. In our hospitality tax, our revenues collected are up 12.4% for the year. Our expenses include $60,000 paid to the CVB for the special events grant. We have added a spreadsheet to the additional reports section, which is page 15, and that shows the monthly receipts for the hospitality and occupancy tax compared to previous years. In our occupancy tax breakdown, the revenue and expenditures are up 1% for the year. All occupancy tax revenues collected, minus a small admin fee, are paid to the CVB monthly. And in the street projects report, we received $215,000 in revenues, which was mostly special assessments, and we have expended $286,000 towards street projects through May. Those are some of the highlights. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Are there any questions or comments regarding the financial report? Other than the financial institution tax, is there anything else that you see that either on the revenue side or the expense side that there's a significant variance that would concern you?
There isn't. I am waiting for an answer back on, I believe it's our oil production tax, the $500,000. We got that in September last year. I just want to verify that we'll be receiving that as a lump sum, because so far we have not received large amounts yet.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Would there be a motion then to approve the report as presented?
Move to approve report.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We have the motion and the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, then we'll vote. Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Altman?
Aye.
Mr. Landblum?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. Move to item B. This is, would be the second reading of ordinance number 1382. It's regarding the Dickinson Police Employee Pension Plan. Mr. Colling, is there anything you'd like to say in way of introduction of this item?
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioners. This ordinance is unchanged from the ordinance that you saw last time around. It does make a change to both the police employees plan and the city employees plan, making clear that when an employee transfers between plans, the provisions of the plan in which the employee is in when he or she retires is the plan that will govern the employee's retirement benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Colling. At this time, I'd ask if there's anyone from the public that would like to comment regarding this proposed ordinance. You may do so. Just step to the podium, state your name, and we'll hear your comments. Anyone from the public? There's no one from the public. I'd invite any comments from commissioners or other city staff. There's no comments from commissioners or city staff. Would there be a motion regarding the second reading?
I will move for second and final reading of ordinance 1382.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have the motion and the second. Any discussion? No discussion. We will vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Landblum?
Aye.
Mr. Oltmans?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. The motion carries. Item C also is the second reading of ordinance number 1383, and again, this involves the pension plans for both the city and the police, and Mr. Colling, would you introduce that one also?
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioners. This ordinance for second and final reading is also unchanged from the ordinance that you saw last time around. This ordinance makes a minor technical change to the police plan, taking out some extraneous language that was inadvertently inserted into the plan. In order to change the code, we need to do that by ordinance, so this effectively is correcting a typographical error within the code. We've never calculated accrued benefits under either the employee's plan or the city police plan as if that language was in there. So this is just making a correction to the existing wording in the code.
Thank you, Mr. Colling. Again, if there is someone from the public that would wish to comment, we'd invite your comments now. Just step to the podium, state your name, and we'd hear your comments regarding this proposed ordinance. There's no one from the public. We'd hear comments now by city commissioners or other city staff. If there's no comments, would there be a motion regarding this ordinance?
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner.
move to approve ordinance number 1383.
We have the motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
And we have the motion and the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we will vote. Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Oltmans?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. Brings us to item D, resolution for disposal of city property. Mr. Kessel, are you introducing this item?
I certainly can, President Johnson. The city staff has gone forth and sought a new contract provider for cell phones. Our public information officer contacted a few different providers. We've moved to a different provider, and so it's rendered the phones that we all used essentially surplus or useless to us. We'd like to sell those on the open market, but before we can do that, we have to surplus them out. And to do that appropriately, because some of those phones may be purchased by city staff, we needed to follow a resolution process in order to achieve that end goal. So resolution before you achieves that end.
The resolution is numbered 12-2000. Should that be 12-2010?
Yes. Thank you for noticing.
Okay, you've heard the introduction by Mr. Kessel. Are there any comments or questions? Would there be a motion regarding resolution number 12-2010?
I'll move for approval.
Do we have a second?
Second.
We have the motion and the second. Any discussion?
Just one question. I think I know the answer, but this is happening regardless of this sale. These are units that are antiquated, are damaged, what?
Some of them are antiquated, and if you look on the back page of the resolution, you'll notice the pricing. The ones that are set at $1, $2 are obviously antiquated, but we do have a few that are not antiquated, and the prices reflect that. So we would like to dispose of them in a way that's proper, I guess.
Okay. Just wanted to make that clear. That's fine.
Mr. Kessel, how did you come up with the prices for the phones?
They were actually provided to us by the provider. We did not set those prices. They came from the cell phone providers themselves.
All right.
Why did you switch?
Because the savings was too hard to ignore.
So we're saving money by switching providers.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Other comments or questions? Did I have a motion on this?
You
We're
did.
just discussing? Okay. Any other discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Oltmans?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. Brings us to item E, which is a Dickinson Urban Forestry Committee item. And is there a presenter from the Forestry Committee? Judge Keel. Welcome.
Mr. Mayor, Commissioners, I have the honor to appear before you on behalf of the Urban Forestry Committee. You have a letter in your packet from me, I believe. I'm happy to tell you that we expect to spend less than projected, and I know you don't hear that every day. The forester has used his discretion in purchasing trees for the Arbor Day planting, which will be, as you know, on South Main, in the area where the tornado last year caused a lot of damage, and he's purchased smaller trees than he thought he might have done earlier. We expect to spend about $7,000. We do have $3,000 or so in the bank. We like to carry a little reserve, but we'll spend it all if we have to. We, of course, approach or are approaching the community for donations. We have, if you received a water bill lately, you'll know what we're talking about, because we have a little letter in there. There's some confusion about the date of Arbor Day this year. It was supposed to be July 10th. Typically, we do it on a Saturday. Today, when most of us at work can get off work and go help plant the trees, but this year, because of the residents in the south side that wanted to have a special event on the day of the tornado anniversary, our event will also be July 8th. There may be some confusion about that. Maybe it'll impact our donations. We don't know. Last year, we received about $2,000 in donation from the public. You know, we're hoping for at least that much this year. And we've approached the commission in years past for some assistance. You've been generous with us. We appreciate that. And as the letter says, since we're spending more money, we thought maybe we should ask for a little more help from the commission. Now it turns out we're spending a little less than we thought, so maybe our needs and wants aren't quite so high, but we still would request whatever financial support you can provide. Again, the money is being spent on trees. They're being planted by city staff and by volunteers, and I understand you all look really good with a shovel in hand, so you're certainly invited to participate and actively plant trees on July 8th. If you have any questions, Justin is here from the Forest Department, and he probably has more details about, if you want to know about the kind of trees you bought or the size, you'd have to ask him, because I don't know.
So are you really asking for $2,000 then, Judge?
We would be happy with any amount, but we're probably, our needs are more like $3,000.
$3,000?
If you have $4,000 for us, we would take good care of whatever's left, but in reality, if history repeats itself, $3,000 would go a long way towards paying for our trees.
And is the entire effort this year on the south side?
Yes.
The south side needs that.
It's already been started, I believe. I don't know the details, but we've already been planting trees. I shouldn't say we. The city has been planting trees on the south side, but that's exactly what the area is. But south of the bridge to some distance to replace the trees damaged by the tornado.
Mr. Keel, where do you purchase these trees?
Maybe you should direct that to Justin.
Welcome to the new commissioners. I'm Justin Offworth, City Forester. As to your question, we purchased some from Second Nature Greenhouse here in Dickinson and some from Taylor Nursery in Taylor, the best sources for the size of the trees that we use.
Yeah, roughly how many trees will you be planting?
There will be a total of 90 trees.
90
that we're
trees.
replacing.
Okay.
So that's why the original estimate was about $100 a tree, which was actually kind of low, but we were able to get some at a slightly reduced rate, which would help cut down the total cost.
Okay.
Is there a warranty on these?
Yes, there's generally is through 1 year.
You know, obviously, this was an extreme event we had a year ago on the south side, and if there was a need, if there was a place to put these other trees, I'd be in favor of doing the $4,000. If ever there was a time to put a little money into planting some trees. I think it's on the south side of Dickinson. It got such a different look now than it did before the tornado. So maybe put that question to you, is there a place to do more than 90?
Unfortunately, as you've pointed out, there is plenty of areas there. The 90 that we're talking about now, 89 of them will be just on the boulevards along Highway 22, south of the bridge, just in that stretch, and then one would be sort of a ceremonial one in a park, but there are several pieces of park property and other public areas down on the south side that will not have any trees because of this Arbor Day project right now. If we were to expand it, then certainly we could work into some of those publicly owned areas as well.
Do you know which account we normally funded the trees from?
The stuff that comes in the city comes from the sales tax, I believe.
Sales.
I cannot tell you which part of it.
From one? Sales tax one, okay. All right, other comments or questions?
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner?
I would have no problem with giving the Urban Forestry Committee $3,000. Obviously, that's one of our main interests in town, and they've done such a nice job with the interest in town, so I feel comfortable giving them $3,000 out of the sales tax one fund.
Commissioner Jackson has suggested the full amount of $4,000 so that they would have a little extra money to plant trees in the public areas. And I know there's a park over near the elementary school where a number of larger trees were destroyed in the tornado last year. How would you feel about the full $4,000? So
I'd be okay with that.
You'd be okay with that? I think I just need a motion and we can go forward.
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner.
move to provide the Forestry Committee $4,000 from the sales tax one fund.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
We have the second. Additional discussion? Hearing none, we'll proceed to vote. Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Oltmans?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries.
Thank you all.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and we certainly wish to encourage you to take part in all the Arbor Day activities, including planting the trees, and I think we'll provide shovels for you, so hope to see you there. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Keel, I know you're a judge and a very good attorney, and you know all five of us can't show up at the same place. That would violate the open meetings law. So I would suggest that the two newly elected commissioners represent the whole commission and help you plant those trees, you know.
Are you looking for a motion?
I think that would be a great idea, and I'm sure they'd be demonstrate some ability, you know, especially Mr. Landrum. I've known him a long time, and I know that he can handle a shovel with the best of you.
Mr. Keel, I do have a question for you. I know that there's going to be a Tornado Survivors fundraiser that day with a barbecue and a celebration of everybody. And it's going to have a nonprofit component. Has the Arbor Day Foundation approached them to see if some of the funds raised that night could help supplement the funding that you need for the work that you're doing?
Well, not as such. I mean, we do expect that, generally speaking, the population of the city is certainly aware of the problem in that part of town and the need, and we expect going to be very generous with donations to our fund for the trees. We're not going to solicit that group who've already suffered so much for our project. If they want to donate in some fashion, that's fine, but we are not going to piggyback on their event to try to help our budget. But it's a rare opportunity probably to have both these events tied together, and so that we can do and we hope many of them will be involved in our tree planting as well, because it's their neighborhood, and we hope that somehow it'll all work together. I don't know all the details of these two events exactly, but there's going to be communication. I know Mr. The city administrator is Kessel. I can't read from here, you know. But I know that he's been involved, and that the coordination will will be there. But I think it's a fine, it's unfortunate that we had a tornado, of course, but now we try to pick up the pieces and go on, so. Thank you very much.
You know, when you present your 2011 budget request to Mr. Kessel, you probably should remember his name then.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
And you can expect it'll be higher than lower, so, thank you.
Mr. Kessel, since the event to commemorate the first anniversary of the tornado has been mentioned, are you reporting on that at all?
I did plan to report. It's not on the agenda, but I did plan to report on that.
Maybe not, since we've just talked about, maybe now would be a good time just to comment on that.
Certainly. A few weeks ago, I was contacted by some residents from the south side. The city had been planning some type of an appreciation event for the volunteer effort that occurred during the July 8th tornado recovery and response. The residents on the south side that contacted me were already planning an event that included a block party, so to speak. It was quickly growing larger because of the interest than they thought they could handle, and approached myself to assist them with that coordination. As of today, and this committee will meet again this week on Thursday to define these events even further. But as of today, the events will take place on July 8th, the actual day of the tornado. The tentative schedule of events includes tree planting during the early afternoon that will end around 4 o'clock. Allow those folks, which it sounds like Commissioners Landblum and Oltman are going to need a shower in between planting trees and then attending the actual events. We are planning speakers to begin around 5 o'clock. The Governor Hoeven, General Sprincenatic, Emergency Manager Wills have all indicated that they will be attending the event and speaking at the event. We are also planning an appreciation supper that would start around 6 o'clock and go for approximately an hour and a half, and then at 8 o'clock there would be a street dance or some other variety of music that will be at the event. We are currently seeking donations, and I think Commissioner Oltman's idea of donating any extra dollars to the Urban Forestry Committee is an excellent one. We hope to cover the expenses with the donations, and anything in excess would be that would be an excellent source. So we'll be refining these, as I say. We'll also be publicizing them as soon as these refinements occur. But that's currently what we're talking about. And Judge Richards, I mean Keel, if you'll accept the dollars, if we have any extra, we'll be happy to donate them to you.
We'll take good care of it.
If someone wishes to donate, who do they make a check out to, and who do they give it to?
Right now, the Arts in the Park has agreed to be the entity to accept the dollars. If you recall, they are also the entity that put together the fundraising event that occurred shortly after the tornado itself. So if you are interested, simply you can donate dollars to Arts in the Park. In the memo line, simply indicate that this is for the appreciation event.
Just a little clarification, it's Arts on the Prairie.
Excuse me, Arts on the Prairie.
Okay. Anything else on that? Very good. All right, we'll move to tab 5, Public Safety, and we'll hear from Chief Seebuck.
President Johnson, Commissioners, in our report for the month of May, you'll see that in the 25 incidents that we recorded, we did record a general alarm response to a structure fire. The good news is that it was a very small fire. The way it was reported caused us to respond with a full department, but it wasn't a typical general alarm fire, fortunately. But we still recorded it as a general alarm response, however. I'd like to also report that one of our senior officers, one of our captains, has retired after 25 years of service with us, 25 years of service as a volunteer, Darrell Wayner. has stepped down. He is going to stay with the department in a reserve status, however. And as I said, he served the community and the fire department for 25 years as a volunteer firefighter. He will continue to serve the community as one of our reserves, and also he is involved with Dickinson Ambulance, so he will continue his public safety service to the community. He was a very strong asset for the department. We're glad that we're retaining him in some capacity, and at the same time, we're sorry to see him go. We thank him for his 25 years. I wanted to make you aware of that and make sure that we recognize that. Also, at the last commission meeting, we talked about our radios and the need to get some RFPs into the hands of vendors. We did mail out those RFPs last week to 4 separate vendors, along with running an advertisement in the newspaper. So we should be looking at, or we are looking at a July 14th date to have those back in, and we can start reviewing them. And lastly, I'd like to remind the community that the 4th of July is fast approaching, and by city code, by adopted city fire code, the use of fireworks within city limits is prohibited. We encourage everybody to enjoy the public display and to have a safe 4th of July. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Chief. Are there any comments or questions for Chief Seebuck? All right, thank you. Hear from Chief Rummel.
Good evening, Mr. President, Commissioners. Before you, I'll talk to you about the May Traffic Services Report, which you should have a copy in your packet. In the month of May, there were 56 accidents reported, and there is a typo there. It says April, but it's actually May. 5 of those were hit and runs. 7 of those 56 reported accidents were injury-related accidents as well. There were, on the next page, there were 10 school zone contacts made for this month of May. The second report to follow is the South Sakakawea Narcotics Task Force report for the month of May. Looks like they were involved in four cases. 2 of those cases involved prescription drug violations. Also during that month, Officer Gates attended the second half of his drug recognition expert training. That should serve us well with that training going on. With that, I would entertain any questions or comments. Okay. Should I continue on or not?
I think so.
Chief Rummel,
Yes.
how do you handle the hit and run situations?
On some of those hit and run situations, we try not, I mean, we do not close them if we do have evidence. There is follow-up investigations that are conducted through the use of the body shops, contacting body shops, that kind of thing. Many times, though, there may be minor damage to these, to the victims of these hit and runs, and there is no evidence that could support us following up on that.
There you go.
Okay. Also included in the packet was the year-end report. Sorry for the tardiness. It's been kind of a busy year, but you will find the first couple pages deal with the 2009 police department with, you know, the word I'm looking for slips my mind. Organizational chart, thank you. The one thing I would like to explain, though, is that if you look to the patrol officers' years of service, we're looking at 1.5 for patrol officers for years of experience in the year 2009. That's a young department. And with that, we really need the experience, and only time can give us that experience. Of course, these guys are all trained, but what it does when they're a young department like that, there is a period of time where a training officer is assigned. So what that does is it ties up a couple officers to the training to make sure it's proper, that officer is properly trained. It's called a Field Training Program, or FTO. The other thing, as it goes on, as the report goes on, we focused on the arrests for the year. And with the exception of 2007, things pretty much remain kind of consistent. They were down in some areas, up in others. Drug arrests were up, drug paraphernalia. That does not include the South Sakakawea Narcotics Task Force arrests. These are just police department arrests. So I wanted you to know that. Aggravated assaults were up, whereas the simple assaults were down. So it remains, like I say, pretty consistent, except for 2007. And I just can't tell you what happened in that year, but it was a different type of year. Rather than go page by page, if there's any questions or comments or anything that you would like me to comment on, I sure would take those now.
Any questions or comments for the chief?
Chief, Mr. Chief Romo.
Yes.
Can you just give us what the difference is? I see the aggravated assaults arrests are at 20, and the simple assault arrests are at 14. Can you just give us an explanation what the difference between the two are?
Between simple assault and aggravated assault. Aggravated assault is the more serious. It's the assaults where there's a danger of life being lost or serious injury, versus a simple assault would be a black eye, a scuffle in a bar, that kind of thing where there's an altercation, some pushing maybe. Aggravated assault is much more serious than that. A weapon of some sort was possibly used, or the injuries extend to them all where they had to go to the hospital, to the emergency room. So that's the difference.
Yep, thank you.
Okay?
Okay, thank you, chief.
Thank you very much.
We'll move to tab 7, Public Works. Mr. Rapp.
Thank you, Mr. President. The first item you have before you tonight is the approval of resolution amending our fee schedule. If you recall, during the last meeting, we've switched equipment in the way we handle septic waste brought into our wastewater treatment plant. Prior to that, we always had it out at the Baylor building where we could weigh those loads and adjust that fee based on the amount of solids and stuff that they've got on those trucks. With the installation of new equipment out at our pre-treatment building, we have to measure that and bill it by volume. So our recommendation is to adjust our fee schedule from a $2 per ton charge to $15 per thousand. And also this resolution's got 2009 on it too, but the recommendation is to approve the resolution to amend our fee schedule.
Do we have a resolution number for this?
2011 would be our next resolution.
20? No. It'd have to be a 2-digit number dash 2010.
Mr. President, it'd be 18-2010.
Okay. Thank you. All right, this was reported on at the previous meeting. It's been reported on here again. Are there comments or questions by commissioners? I think last time we asked, when you calculate this out in terms of the being equivalent, since you're changing measurement methods, this is an increase. And do you recall what roughly the percentage increase
Looking
is?
back, the average, President Johnson, was about $11 per 1,000 gallons based on weight. This would be increased, but we've also installed fairly expensive equipment out at the pre-treatment building to be able to handle the hauled waste into the city. There's some of this waste that does come from the city limits with sand and silt separators, but a vast majority of this comes from outlying areas into the city.
And then we process it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe this is just a curiosity question, but do we have any way of knowing what our volume is compared to other communities on a proportionate basis?
Hauled waste-wise? Or
the disposal of the septic waste. Is there any way to get a handle on that?
Commissioner Jack, can be very difficult and stuff too. There's a lot of communities that don't accept hauled waste. City of Bismarck does. They charge $25 per thousand. They bring it into their mechanical plant, and they can actually pull indoors and do it. I don't believe Fargo or West Fargo accept it. I know Jamestown's looking at starting to accept it. It's something we've done for a number of years. You know, there isn't a lot of place to dispose of this unless you've got something on site, you know, to contain the material and stuff, to, or land apply it. That, you know, by providing the service and stuff too, we do keep it out of the rivers and streams, and from an environmental standpoint, it's a good service to offer.
How did you arrive at the $15 per 1,000 gallons?
Took a look at, Commissioner Olman, the previous charge on a per ton basis and calculated back to the, you know, the volume wise and stuff too, and then plus what the cost of equipment is, to basically looking at paying that over a 10-year period. We've got roughly about $63,000 tied up in equipment at the pre-treatment building to be able to accept this waste.
And so you're looking at a 10-year payback?
Roughly
with
about
the
yes.
fees? And
You know,
what,
and that volume changes so much
Sure.
stuff too, is just kind of a,
how about length of life on the equipment that you had to purchase to be able to do it? And does that all match up?
depending on a lot of times
Hypothetically.
on the amount of solids and stuff too. I mean, it's really hard to, the equipment put in place without, the grinder's probably going to be the most high maintenance item and stuff too. The card reading system, the meter and stuff to measure the volume and stuff, that should have a long life on it, but the equipment that actually grinds that material up and separates the solids off and stuff too will be the highest wear item, and that's really depending on the type of material that comes in.
I'll move we approve the resolution.
We have the motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
We have the motion and the second. Any other discussion you'd like to have regarding this item?
Mr. President,
Mr.
Mike-
Foley?
just briefly, I was incorrect. This should be Resolution 19-2010.
Okay. Anything else? Not, we'll vote then. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Altman?
Aye.
Mr. Landblom?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries.
Thank you. Next item was in regards to the preliminary injury report that was approved at the last City Commission meeting. After visiting with Mr. Kessler and Attorney Coling, Commissioner Jackson asked the question if we'd be able to submit this in the future to the State Revolving Loan Fund reimbursement, and the answer to that was at that time, yes. But by passing the funding resolution, it allows us a lot more flexibility on how we could fund this project, whether it's bonds or private loans or other different mechanism stuff too, that by putting this in place, it allows a lot more opportunity and a lot more different directions we can look at funding the future expansion of our wastewater treatment plant. So our recommendation is to approve the funding resolution to allow that flexibility.
Mr. Colleen, if we didn't pass this and went forward and then at a later date decided that the bonding was the way to go, we would not be able to do that without acting favorably on this resolution today. Am I correct on that?
That's correct. Federal Treasury regulations require that, require that if you are going to use municipal bond funding to fund a project, there needs to be a prior declaration before you're able to do that. So the city would need to make this declaration that you may or will intend in the future to use municipal bonds to fund this. If you don't make that prior declaration, then the municipal bond funding is not available to you.
But this doesn't commit us to municipal bond funding.
That's correct.
It just keeps the option alive.
Correct.
Okay. And would this be Resolution 20 then?
20-2010.
Okay. Well, you've heard Mr. Rapp's recommendation and some of Mr. Colling's explanation. Are there other comments or questions regarding this proposed resolution?
I guess for either one of you, I know in the case of improvement districts with special assessments, that ultimate cost has to be within a certain percentage of the preliminary cost. Is there any requirement like that in this kind of a situation? We're probably talking revenue bonds here or something, I would guess.
At this point, there is not. There may be at some point in the future, you'd have to pass an actual resolution to create the bonds, but for this prior declaration, that is not a requirement.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? All right. Did we have a motion? Okay, is there a motion regarding this resolution?
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner?
move to approve Resolution 20-2010.
We have the motion, is there a second?
I'll second it.
We have the motion and the second. Further discussion? There's no further discussion, we'll go ahead and vote. Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Altman?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. President. The next item is a declaration of surplus inventory. You were provided a list. Most of these fittings have been around for 20-plus years. A lot of them are obsolete, and they're not usable anymore in the repair and replacement of water mains. So we're requesting tonight to basically declare that list surplus, and then we'll dispose of it as pretty much scrap. We've tried to see if some of the smaller communities around the area would be interested in any of these fittings and stuff too, and they're so old that no one even wants to use them. So instead of continuing to carry these on our inventory on a yearly basis, we're just asking to declare them surplus and dispose of those items. The total cost of that inventory is about $7,930.38. 39 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. You've heard his request and his explanation. Do you have any comments or questions regarding this item?
Have you been able to determine a scrap value for these once you take them off the
No,
truck, or-
Commissioner Altman will have to strip them down and take all the gaskets, and some of the bolts and stuff we'll hang on to and stuff too that we can use, but the steel barrels and things like that will be, minimal weight and stuff, but they'll be sold as scrap steel.
Any other comments, questions?
We need a
motion.
I'll move that we approve the declaration of surplus inventory.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion, the second. Discussion? Further discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Altman?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries.
Thank you. The last item is just for your information. We're going to be bidding out our cemetery excavation contract. It's a 2-year contract. Our current contract will expire October 1st of 2010. We normally bid this out in July, August to allow the excavator ample time to, if they don't get the bid, to make that transition. I do plan to meet with the funeral directors over the next couple of weeks to go over the changes and any concerns that they've got over the past 2 years in regards to this contract. And then we will be advertising this for bid. And then we'll be coming back to the City Commission for approval or toward the bid at a later date. So if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer them, or contact City Administrator Kessler, myself.
Mr. Kessel, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to say I thank you for remembering my name.
Why would I forget?
Is there
Anything else?
Mr.
Any questions here regarding the cemetery?
Mr. President, Mr. Rapp, is there any type of standards that the city uses in determining the most qualified individual?
In the past, a lot of times, Mr. Lamblum too, if it's a new cemetery excavator and stuff too, will inspect the equipment that they're using, ensure that they've got the proper piece of equipment to perform the services in the cemetery. If they've done work in other areas, we'll do background checks on them. The current individual we've got right now was new to this contract, I believe, 4 years ago. Basically took a look at list of equipment that he had on hand, went out and looked at equipment and just visited with them and go that direction.
So there's not necessarily one with experience in performing this type of function?
Other than our current, and then also we've had 2 previous excavators that have done these services in the past that may bid on them.
Mr. Rapp, I was reading through the advertisement for the bids, and it's pretty extensive as far as the information that you go into. I guess my only question is, for the bidding process, is this a freshly written bid, or is this one that you've used over the last few years so that we know that there aren't any
It's,
surprises?
it's a previous contract we've used in the years past. There are a few changes, and those are all underlined in that information you've got. Some of these are just things that we need to clarify and work on. And some of these things are some of the things I've talked to the funeral directors in the past, we're going to look at incorporating, and we may or may not incorporate those into the new contract. But anything, any changes we've done are actually either bold and they're underlined.
Well, this doesn't require any action at this time. Mr. Rapp was just informing us that the process is about to begin here again. And I think he's, you know, if you have input, he would take that input now or sometime after the meeting.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have a 6 p.m. Timetable agenda item. This has to do with a final plat for a subdivision by the name of Lyons. Mr. Soren, do you have any introductory remarks you would like to make before we begin?
Yes, President Johnson. This is the final plat for Lyons subdivision. This subdivision is located northeast of town, approximately half a mile north of the city limits. It is an 18-lot subdivision, currently zoned agricultural. The intent of this is to turn it into a single-family R1 zoning district for residential development in the area. Planning and Zoning has reviewed this plat and is recommending approval of this final plat to City Commission.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Soren. Do we have a resolution number for this resolution, Mr. Colling?
Mr. President, this would be Resolution 21-2010.
Okay. Well, at this time, I'd ask if commissioners have any comments or questions that they'd like to make regarding this item.
Mr. President,
Mr. Jackson.
I've got a number of comments. You know, we're seeing a lot of subdivisions. We're going to see a lot more in the near future, and I think we really have to take a good, intense look at each one. The subdivision itself, you know, I think probably looks fine, and probably seems pretty innocuous on the whole, but there are 2 or 3 issues that I think we need to address. I don't know if the rest of you drove up to this area and took a look at it, but the subdivisions to the north, I think just were approved within the last couple of years. Small subdivisions, a small number of lots. Streets that are platted as public streets but not constructed. I know that's causing the county some heartburn. Right now there aren't a lot of residences there, but there will be someday. Those lots will fill in and there are going to be streets that aren't constructed, and I don't know how they'll get constructed. I know there are other jurisdictions that do what I'm going to suggest tonight, and that is that we approve the plat contingent on the developer constructing those streets prior to filing the plat. To some design standard that is set forth by our city engineer. Maintenance, and I should back up, you know, this plat is outside the city limits, but it's within the 2-mile jurisdiction that we are given by state law, the responsibility that we're given in state law. Regardless of that responsibility that state law gives us, I hope that we feel a responsibility to give oversight to all these subdivisions and make them worthy of what we want Dickinson to look like. There's probably a lot of different ways to do that, but one of the things is the street situation. The streets to the north are not constructed. the streets to the north are going to be an issue for somebody at some point in time. County, city, individuals that will live along that street. The streets to the north, because they're not constructed, are going to be an issue to this development. And in a sense, it's an unfairness because residents in this subdivision are going to have to pass through those unconstructed streets to the north. And now that those plats are approved and filed, there's no good way to get that done to the north. I expect this developer has good intentions, but I believe that we shouldn't approve the plat or any other plat in this kind of proximity to Dickinson without the requirement that the streets be constructed prior to the plat being filed. There would be an alternative that we could consider, and that would be is that the city, ask the developer for a bond in the amount of the proposed construction as a guarantee, as a safeguard. Now, I expect the developer is going to want to build those streets right away anyway. I would think to market those lots that you'd want to build the streets. Take the conversation a little bit further. Burley County, I know, requires a similar action, but Burley County goes further and requires pavement within a certain distance from the city. This development, for any of us that were at the meeting last Monday morning, we heard discussion about urban growth area. We have a lot of area outside of city limits, but within our 2-mile jurisdiction that probably wouldn't be considered a logical urban growth area. This, I believe, would be, even though we haven't formally designated as such. It's an area that's being actively developed in the last couple of years, will be in the next couple of years. We need to see this, whether annexed or not, as an extension of Dickinson. We need to think about the provision of other infrastructure in this area and other considerations as well. And the start is making sure that we get these streets right. I'll bring up one other item. If you look at the map that Mr. Soren provided to us right before the meeting, I'm not finding mine. Thanks, Bud. In the next month or two, we will have before us a quite large commercial and industrial subdivision to the west of this tract. Quarter section of land, approximately 163 acres. It butts up against, I believe, the west boundary of this plat?
Yes, it does.
Okay. We won't see that for a month or two, but it's an extensive industrial and commercial subdivision. I believe strongly that subdivision ought to be annexed. It ought to come into the city limits. It ought to be an urban development, as is the rest of our city. That begs the question about this subdivision, because it would be contiguous to this other large subdivision. I'm not sure that, well, I know I don't have the answer to all of this, but I know that we need to consider it. We need to ponder it. We need to think about what we're doing when we approve these subdivisions. Again, to summarize, I think there's a half section of land to the north in our northeast quadrant. It's developing fast. It's very close to our city limits. I just think we need to take a good hard look at it. So, I don't know what the thoughts are for the rest of you, but those are mine.
Mr. Jackson, I would agree with you. I have a client that lives on Park Avenue, just south of Park Avenue Villa. And when he purchased his house there, he almost backed out of it because he didn't know if he wanted to live that far out of town when his house was built. And that wasn't in the greater scheme of things all that many years ago. And when you think that that was far out of town, and you look at this new division and how close it is in proximity, and how soon it could be in kind of the heart of our community, I think you're right that we have to take a long look at how is it being developed, and will it fit into the greater scheme of how our community needs to be laid out and the curb appeal that we want to have in the future.
Other comments? Mr. Colling, I have a question for you regarding annexation. At the planning, special planning meeting that we held, you explained the annexation process, and I want to see if I've got it right. If there is no annexation requirement on these developments outside the city, once they're allowed to go ahead, if they're to be annexed into the city just can't go take that property. It takes, is it 75% of the landowner's approval in those areas to vote or say yes to annexation for it to take place?
That's correct, Mr. President. 75% of the landowners in the area to be annexed would have to agree to the annexation.
So if we don't make annexation a requirement at the time of the plat approval, it's then just subject to that 75%.
That's correct.
And so that's really Mr. Jackson's point on the development that he's saying is going to come before us in the not too distant future, that if we as a commission don't say that that should be annexed, then we just kind of leave it to chance after that.
That's correct, Mr. President. There's, to put a little bit of a gloss on that, there's a procedure under the annexation rules under state law where the parties can go into mediation to see if there is some workable arrangement if 75% of the landowners don't agree to annexation. It's very rarely used and only in fairly extreme situations. In general, though, it's always going to be easier to annex in at the platting stage before the property begins to get sold off and divided among property owners.
Okay. So that's really the issue that's being raised here on this other property. I guess the question I have for Mr. Soren is, and this probably just shows, I guess, not understanding how the rules work, but when we approve these developments outside the city limits, out in the county, and they would be properly platted, I just assumed that the streets were being put in, that those were paved streets with curb and gutter because they were platted. There's apparently, I was out there this afternoon with Mr. Jackson looking at some of these, and you know, streets that are supposed to be public streets really aren't streets.
In the county, it's been the county standard that the roads have been built to, and several of them they've said we don't want them, just use them as a private drive. And that's kind of the struggle we're going through right now. Other subdivisions, they've come with cross sections required, you know, ditches and the 28-foot road surface or things of that nature. It's something that they're struggling with, and we've been meeting with them and struggling with how do we handle that as well. This particular case is kind of where it came to really delight when we have a public access north of here. The county said we don't want the road, just build your driveway in there. Now we've got a subdivision that's planning to come south of it that's potentially needing to utilize that road to come through there. And now the road's not built, so how do we get it to that point? So it's certainly an issue, and I think Mr. Jackson's right. Up front is when we need to get those things addressed and try and work with the county on the cross-section. One of the issues that they do see is if we require pavement, curb and gutter, it's a different level of maintenance that is a burden on them, and whether they want that level is still the part of the debate right now, I guess, as we're moving forward.
When you say burden on them, you mean the county?
On the county, correct.
When you drive up there and look, it isn't that far from the city. I mean, it's not that hard to envision the city growing out to this subdivision in a relatively short period of time. So I agree. I think Mr. Jackson does have a point.
You know, I'm not blind to the additional cost this is going to be for a developer. I'm not blind to the significance of this kind of a decision. And I'm also not afraid to admit that this particular subdivision is a little bit more gray, perhaps, than what I think the subdivision to the west will be. But I come back to what we want our city to look like. The extraterritorial area is a difficult area to do land use planning, to do code enforcement, because of the dual jurisdiction. It's difficult because we do share jurisdiction with the county. Technically, the maintenance issues are county issues, yet it's up to us to approve the plat and put the conditions on the plat. I know that in hindsight, the subdivisions to the north, we absolutely should have required that those streets be constructed. And then whoever is responsible for maintenance at least has something to work with. We can't correct what's happened in the past, but
Was there a concern that was raised by any of the representatives from the county when or before the planning and zoning?
As regard to
To
this
the-
plat specifically, or?
To that plat, as well as the road access and the standards that roads should be developed?
Well, I guess to answer that is difficult, but yeah, they have some concerns that are addressed. The county's not wanting any additional burdens to be placed on them, meaning any roads. So there's a sense that I'm getting from them that they don't necessarily want any right-of-ways taken through the platting process. I think we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't ensure that we're capturing that right-of-way and the access to and from these parcels and making sure that we can continue our road system throughout them. So it definitely, they have concerns about the maintenance and so forth, and they don't necessarily have a good grasp on the final answer to the process. Looking at it, I think we need to establish a cross-section. They need to get the roads in place, and they need to be completed so we don't end up with these issues. And we're going to have to continue to work with the county on how we solve those issues that they have and moving forward.
Which also speaks to the discussion we had, or the presentation we had, about having a planning department for both the city and the county that would be able to blend these particular issues. The other concern I have in the discussion of annexation, once we start talking about annexation and the juxtaposition of this particular subdivision, we're talking about the introduction of water and sewer into the city systems. And it becomes another factor as to our ability within the city to handle additional growth, and at what expense and what physical capability. Just a concern I'm throwing out at this point.
it's absolutely a concern. But at a minimum, the subdivision can be laid out so that it can accommodate sewer and water. It doesn't mean we have to require that right now. But the subdivision should be laid out so that it can accommodate it. This entire area, in my opinion, this entire area of Northeast Dickinson with future platting needs to be laid out so that it can accommodate city water and sewer. It's another question as to when that might happen. I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. I don't have it.
Well, I noticed that the size of the lots accommodate individual sewer systems. They're over 40,000 square feet. I imagine that they're going to tie into Southwest Water at someplace. Or are they going to look at individual wells?
Don't think that's a given.
That's not a given?
I don't think so.
At any rate, as close as this subdivision is to the core of our community, I think that it needs to be planned as if it's going to be the heart of our community at some point.
And I think that's the point. Whether this is in or out of incorporated limits, it's part of our community. Whether it's in or out of incorporated limits. And it's our job, buck ends here, as to what we want our community to look like.
And at the meeting that we were all at on that Monday, it was the county that was saying that they wished that 20 and 30 years ago, the thought process had went into the development so that they wouldn't be facing the issues that they're facing today on developments that were made 20 and 30 years ago. And if we want to repeat that cycle, then we just approve this as it is. If we want to stop that cycle and have a turning point and really look forward in the development of our community, then I think we need to look at these issues so it doesn't keep coming up.
Mr. Shorn, are there any other subdivisions that are being proposed within that proximity, either on the outlying areas that have gone through the process? We have, there's so many of these subdivisions that are coming through the planning and zoning that it's difficult to stay ahead as to what's being proposed and where the location is. Are there any other subdivisions in that immediate location?
Well, the big one is the 163 acres to the west of that.
Right.
There is a 10-acre subdivision to the north, directly to the east of the current subdivision. It's kind of behind the title there, but it runs north and south. It's another 10-acre tract that they're adding on to that existing plat that's there, or is being proposed right now.
This is behind the Coca-Cola and Two's?
It'd be behind that, behind
East of it.
Champion, to the east.
Yep.
So those are two just in that area that are being looked at right now.
Okay.
Other questions or comments?
Mr. President, just a
Steiner.
comment. I think Mr. Jackson has a strong argument here, and it makes sense. And, I think when as commissioners, we do have to look at the future of the city and the extent to which it's growing and which it reaches out. And it does make sense for us to do something with this now instead of trying to face the problem or somebody else sitting here in a few years to do it. So I don't think this is the first one that we're going to get approached on, so I think it's a good place for us to start.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Steiner. Mr. Jackson, would you be prepared to move a motion regarding the final plat of the Lyons subdivision?
I will. But I'd like to discuss the annexation thing a little bit more. There is a logistical issue here that we cannot, this is not contiguous, so I believe we cannot annex this at this time.
That's correct, Mr. Jackson. Needs to be contiguous.
So, what would have to happen here if we're serious about the annexation issue, and I think we should be, is that we would have to wait until the subdivision to the west comes before us, which could be a couple months, and then bring it in together, because then it would be contiguous if we bring in that subdivision. That's going to cause the developer a 2 or 3 month delay. If that's in the best interests of our community, then that's what we have to do. But it could cause the developer some hardship.
So what are you suggesting?
I want us all to be aware of that. And it may just be the imperfection of the situation that we're just going to have to live with, and unfortunately, the developer will have to live with.
If we pass or approve a resolution tonight with the conditions that you've brought forward, and the developer goes ahead, then the annexation issue becomes one, again, of we would have to get 75% approval there for the annexation to take place.
We would be in a situation that we would be requiring annexation for 2 different subdivisions in order for the plats to be approved.
If we don't approve the resolution tonight, then you could wait your 2 or 3 months till the other development is presented.
That's right.
Well, is that a viable option?
I have a question on the 75%. Is that 75% of all of the lots or 75% of the occupied lots? If there's only 4 lots sold, do you only need to get 3, or is it that how does that work?
Mr. President, Mr. Oltman's, it goes by property ownership. So even if a lot is unoccupied, it still has an owner, and that owner has the right to object. And it should make clear, too, it's not 75% of the number of property owners, but it's 75% of the area represented by that proposed annexation area.
Okay.
I'd like to comment on it since I'm a developer, if I could.
Just a second. Let's see if there's any other discussion here first, and then do you have other comments or questions?
Just a clarification, if we pursue this, it really does nobody any good for us to approve the plat tonight. If we're going to make it contingent on annexation, it doesn't hurt to wait the 2 or 3 months, because it will do, the plat won't be filed for that 3 months anyway. And that's a little bit unfortunate for the developer, but it's what we'll have to do.
So one of the alternatives we have then is just to table any action on this matter. It would be one of the 3 options then.
Is that correct, Mr. Colling? We could just table also, and
You do have that option available to you as well.
other comments or questions here?
Are there any other annexation, any other plats or lands looked at currently for annexation? It's been a long time since the city's annexed any land. Are there any others that are being talked about or proposed at this?
I think we'll be discussing it on the next agenda item. At least I will be.
More than what? More than this 163 acres? And
Our next agenda item tonight.
on this agenda item, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Other than that, I'm not aware of anything.
Okay. You're talking about one down south? Okay.
Anything else here? Okay, Mr. Tews.
I'm Tracy Tews, and I'm proposing Lyons subdivision. There's 130 acres between our subdivision and the city of Dickinson. Wouldn't you need their 75% vote to be annexed in, or are you guys just going to spot annex this subdivision? There's 130 acres from Lyons subdivision to Dickinson. And there's at least 7 other property owners involved in that.
I think what Mr. Jackson has suggested is if this 163-acre development to the west and to the south of your development actually comes before us, it would be contiguous to the city. That would be the piece of property that we would be talking about annexing, your property would then be contiguous to that property. And I think at this point, that is what he envisions in terms of annexation on that particular action.
And Mr. Johnson, even if the 152 acres that Mr. Knutson is developing to the west of my property, even if the annexation comes through on that, you have Mr. Porter, the Kilwine Family Trust, and 2 other landowners that have to agree to that annexation as well, that are not annexed into the city, that would have to, you'd have to get 75% of that, I would assume. So there's a lot of if-ands with this, with over the past 4 or 5 years. I'm not opposed to you guys putting the approval on this subdivision and making the roadways and the public right-of-way streets be built to county road specs. I'm not opposed to that. Annexation, if there's got to be a 75% met, that's going to take a while. And if it's going to take years and years, the city can just buy the land from me then, rather than wait for annexation, because I bought this land to develop it, not look at it.
Well, that may be, but it still has to be developed well in accordance with, I think, a good development plan here for the entire city.
Mr. President, if I could.
Mr. Jackson.
The way this would have to happen, one of the things I think that Mr. Tooze is referring to is that Mr. Dan Porter owns a strip of land north of Walmart, would maybe be the easiest way to describe that. That would have to be annexed too, in order for us to annex this large industrial commercial subdivision. We can't jump, we can't skip. So that would have to be annexed too. I don't think we've had any conversations with Mr. Porter about that. We need to do that. But either way, that would come in together. That would have to come in as one tract. And I suspect that the developer of the industrial subdivision will carry the day from the standpoint of the percentage. I think if you check the arithmetic, that if that developer agrees to that contingency, were it to be placed on the approval of that plat, that it would bring in the other properties by arithmetic.
And I can't speak for the other developer, but there is several property owners that also own land that is adjacent to this, including Ike and Sandy Kuntz, that own a large portion of the property, which I bought this land on a contingency from them.
And we may not be talking about that property.
Jason and Lisa Tormashi. There's several other property owners that own land that abut to the 152 and abut to this land too, the Sally's that just went through. So I guess I'm in favor of this, building the right-of-ways to county road spec and making the assurance that everything lines up on 6th and 7th and doing it properly, other than what Northview did. But other than that, annexation could be quite a ways out, and so could the 152 acres or the subdivision across the road. I think there's multitude of subdivision problems going on in Dickinson and Stark County. I can't solve them all.
Nor will we be able to. But I think we have to proceed on what we know today. And today there is a subdivision being proposed, 163 acres to the west of you. We have to assume that that's going to come to fruition. And if the decision is that we think it's best for the community to annex it, that's what we'll propose, then this could come to. It's an imperfect situation, but it's the best we can do. I don't know how else to do it.
Mr. Soren, I have a question, and I guess this is a question for both Mr. Soren and Mr. Jackson, but I think I understood Mr. Jackson when we were talking about the streets on this subdivision, that they would be built really like a city street. And I've heard Mr. Tooze say he'd be in favor, of building them to county standards. Are the county standards the same as the city standards, and were you referring to city standards when you were referring to building these streets?
You know, I'm certainly open to some thoughts on this. I think where I'm headed tonight is that I will probably offer a motion to approve the subdivision, dependent with the qualifier of annexation, of building the streets to a standard provided by Mr. Soren, and paving the streets. I'm not sure we need to require curb and gutter, but I think we should require pavement. There are a lot of good subdivisions, good urban subdivisions that are large lots that don't have curb and gutter. And I think done right, we can do a nice subdivision in our city that way. It's a little bit different when you've got 70-foot lots, one after another with normal density. This is a lesser density situation, and I think there's room to compromise that particular aspect of street construction.
Comments, Mr. Soren?
There is definitely a different standard between county and city, and one of the major ones is curb and gutter versus ditches for conveying the water along the streets. Pavement, that's a whole nother segment to it that's not necessarily different. You know, pavement designs would be very similar. It's just the curb and gutter and drainage and driveways getting into the property would be kind of the major differences between the two.
So we are talking a little difference between what would be required here in the county versus city type of street.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Mr. Tooze?
The nearest asphalt road is a half-mile one way and a quarter-mile the other. And the other roadway that's a quarter-mile to the east isn't an asphalt road, it's a chip-sealed road. And the whole Rush House subdivision has chip-sealed roads within it. So I think asphalt would be totally obtrusive to this subdivision. The asphalt wouldn't go anywhere.
Okay. Mr. Jackson, are you ready for a motion yet?
Sure. Rita, I should have written it. Apologize for that, but I will move that we conditionally approve the Lion subdivision contingent on three things. First of all, eventual annexation or simultaneous annexation, construction of the roads to an engineered standard provided by the city engineer, and thirdly, paved roads.
Third?
Paved roads.
There is a motion. Is there a second? There.
I wonder if I could get a little clarification from Mr. Tucson.
Why don't, let's see if we have a motion. Pardon me?
I'll second for further discussion.
We have a motion, and it's now seconded. Mr. Altman, you'd like some?
I have one more question.
One more question. Mr. Tooze, would you mind coming back up?
Paved streets versus chip sealed. Just walk me through the dynamics of that and the difference to you as a developer.
Chip-sealed street is shot with an MC60 or 80 oil and just layered with rock. Just basically for dust control. Light traffic could go on that.
Okay.
Asphalt is full 4 inches.
Full force, yep, all right, very good.
Thank you. Other discussion, comments, question?
Mr. President, I'm a little concerned about how the provision or the condition regarding annexation may work. There's a provision under state law that agreements not to oppose annexation are void. There are some exceptions to that. but I'm not sure whether those exceptions would apply in this instance. Anytime an annexation resolution is put forward to the property owners, those property owners have an opportunity to object to annexation. If the plat is approved and filed, then I'm not certain whether this resolution would prohibit the property owners, whomever they are, from objecting to annexation.
Thank you. What you're suggesting is that we annex first and then approve the plat?
Yes.
Okay.
If you intend to annex the property, then my recommendation, my suggestion would be to do annexation first.
Okay. My intention in offering the motion was to give the developers some representation or some indication that we will approve the plat as it's laid out and as it's designed. I was hoping to give him at least that much, but in light of what you're saying, I withdraw my motion.
Do you withdraw your second then?
Yes.
Okay, so the motion is withdrawn and the second's withdrawn. Mr. Jackson, do you have an alternate motion in mind?
I don't.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lambo.
I move that we table decision on this particular subdivision until the discussion on annexation is decided for this area.
We have a motion to table. Is there a second?
I will second.
Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner.
I do think by tabling this right now, so we all get a better handle on it, a better idea, and so on, is probably the way to go right now. I feel comfortable with taking another look at it, getting a little more information on this here. I'd be in favor of that.
Mr. President, I think also we need to really recognize what we're doing tonight, and that is that we are seeing this area, excuse me, as part of our primary growth area. That's what we're doing tonight. Is seeing it as part of our primary growth area and saying that we need to see this, all of these subdivisions built at the same standard or a similar standard that we have always expected within the corporate limits of Dickinson. That's essentially what we're saying tonight.
And if I may also offer that I think it behooves us, it's a military term, Mr. President, behooves us to start looking at land use planning as being an integral part of our decision-making process, particularly with situations like this.
Mr. Soren, do we have available, or can it be made available, a drawing of this area that Mr. Jackson has been discussing, so that we could kind of see as it is and as it sounds like it could become in terms of the future? I mean, you have some, some activity in your office regarding these properties.
With the proposed streets and
Not
development in the area, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I'm not looking maybe quite for that detail, but for example, it's been mentioned this industrial development of roughly 163 acres, where that would be relative to existing highways and streets that are in there, and label some of these other developments that are either in place or in planning.
Sure.
Is that something that would be readily available to us?
It can be. Not tonight, but
No.
tomorrow we certainly could have something blowing up showing that area in more detail.
I think, until we have added a planner to our organization, I think we have to, as a commission, look at that kind of detail here. In other words, take a more holistic view of things. So.
Yes. Yes, we can provide that.
Other discussion on the motion? Mr. Kessel.
President Johnson, just to clarify, and associated with this planning, or this subdivision is also a rezoning. Does the motion to table also include that rezoning issue, or is the intention of the commission to take a first reading this evening?
Mr. Lamblin, the way I understood your motion was it just regarded the first item there on the final plat. Is that the way you intended it?
That's my intention.
Okay. So, Mr. Colling, if we were to vote in favor of Mr. Lamblin's motion and table the final plat, do you have a recommendation on how we would proceed with the rezoning petition?
As far as rezoning, Mr. President, rezoning happens by ordinance, so it requires 2 readings and in order to get final passage. You could take first reading of the rezoning petition now, that puts it on your agenda, but does not have any legal effect as far as the rezoning. At that time, it would just take a single second reading to pass the ordinance rezoning the property. That's at your discretion if you wanted to move it that quickly. Otherwise, if you feel there are still some issues up in the air, you may want to table that ordinance as well until such time as the issues regarding annexation of this property are more clearly in view.
You can also act on first reading and hold back on the second reading until such time as the issue is more clear.
That's correct. There's no time limit on how long an ordinance can be there on first reading.
Right. We don't have to act on it 2 weeks from now. Any other discussion? Okay, we'll vote on the motion to table then. Mr. Lamblin?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Ullman?
Aye.
Chair votes aye, so the motion carries. That brings us to the public hearing then on the rezoning petition. So at this time, we would declare the public hearing open, and if there's anyone that wishes to comment on this rezoning issue, you may do so. Just step to the podium, state your name, and we'll hear your comments. So anybody from the public wish to comment?
My name is Jeremy Lyons, and I guess I'm not so much going to comment on this, but a question for clarification, if I could. I was planning on building a house in the Lyons subdivision and have my family in there before the new baby comes in January. But I guess I'm looking for clarification. Are we now waiting until maybe the 160 acres comes through, and then if that does, we come back and revote, and if it doesn't, do we come back and I'm new to this. If you could tell me what I'm going to tell my wife when I get home.
Okay. Mr. Jackson, do you want to take a stab at answering that?
Unfortunately, yes. I think the answer to all those questions is yes. And I was personally aware that there was one home coming, and that's unfortunate with what we've done tonight. But we've got to look at the greater picture. We have to assume that the plat to the west, which is already in the pipeline, will be before planning and zoning next month, I believe, for preliminary plat approval. We have to assume that that's going to continue in the pipeline. Without that, the issue of annexation is moot. So yes, in my opinion, we'd have to back up then and reconsider this plat if the subdivision to the west would not proceed.
So any way we look at it, we just plan on being back here in 2 to 3 months and see what happens.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are these comments regarding the zoning now?
Sure.
Okay.
I'd just like to say on Lyons subdivision, northeast quarter of section 27 township 140 range, 96 west, 5th principal meridian, Stark County. That land's for sale.
Thank you, Mr. Tooze. Any other comments regarding the zoning? not, we'll declare the public hearing closed. Mr. Soren, can you explain what the zoning request is, where the zoning that is presently there, and what it would be zoned to if this request was voted yes on?
Sure, President Johnson. The current zoning for that land is agriculturally zoned. In order to maintain that designation, it would require 5-acre lots. That's the minimum lot size you can have for that. Because these are less than an acre, that requires an R1 designation, or it could go into commercial, but as far as a residential, it requires an R1 designation, and that would be for single family, would not allow horses to be in the area, things of that nature. And that was the intent of the line subdivision, was residential subdivision, single family homes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Soren. Any comments, questions by city staff or city commissioners? So, Mr. Colling, as I see it, we have three options. We can have a motion really to approve the first reading and either pass or not pass it. We can have a motion to not approve the first reading, or we could have a motion to table. Did I get them all?
That's correct, Mr. President.
Okay. So I think at this time, we are ready for a motion, and we'll leave it up to one of you to decide which of those options you would like to start with here.
And what is the ordinance number on this one?
This ordinance would be 1384.
Mr. President, I move that we table the discussion on the change in zoning districts.
Okay, we have a motion to table. Is there a second?
I'll second.
And we have a motion, the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, then we'll vote. Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Altmans?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. So that item will also be tabled. We have a second timetable agenda item. This is another plat. This is referred to as the KLD subdivision. I'm assuming this would be Resolution 22?
That's correct, Mr. President.
Resolution 22-2010. So, are there anything you would like to say in way of introduction, Mr. Soren, regarding this item?
Yes, President Johnson. This is also shown on that vicinity map that I provided you before the meeting. It is on the southeast portion of town. 8th Street Southeast is on the south side of it. 6th Avenue Southeast borders the west side of this property. It is an 8-lot subdivision in that area, and it is being proposed as a limited industrial development. Planning and Zoning has reviewed this one as well and is recommending approval to the City Commission. This one does border directly along the city limits, so I think a lot of the previous discussion plays with this one as well.
Yeah, can you explain to us, again, for the public, what light industrial is?
It's, the zoning goes from a general commercial to a limited industrial to a general industrial. General industrial being the highest industrial use there is, heavy manufacturing, things of that nature. A limited industrial is still a zoning designation for a manufacturing, but typically you wouldn't have outside impacts from that manufacturing and that type of designation. It also allows things such as vehicle storage, shops, that type of development throughout it for some of the smaller companies in town. But it's generally not a commercial in nature.
In terms of the oil industry, what types of businesses might we see there?
I think limited industrial would allow most of the office-type shop that the oil industry has. I don't believe it would allow the big pipe yards and things of that nature outside, but their truck parking and storage of their tankers and things of that nature, as long as they've got spacing requirements, that type of thing could go in that area.
Okay, thank you. Discussion regarding this issue?
Mr. President, if we approve this plat, I again think it needs to be annexed and needs to be developed as an urban subdivision. But I think we need to take a good hard look at the plat itself and the land use being industrial. It's not a black and white thing to me, but I do have concerns about introducing a new land use in this quadrant of town. We have no industrial in this quadrant of the community. The area adjacent to it was identified a number of years ago as a residential area, specifically for manufactured homes. We have mobile home court to the kitty corner across the intersection. It's been said we're on a truck route. It's a truck route in a soft sense of the word. We are not diverting traffic onto that route. The city constructed a road some years ago that would handle truck traffic and that would give an alternate route for truck traffic along that route. But we're not putting on load restrictions to actually divert truck traffic to that road. I believe, Mr. Soren, that this is being offered as the first phase. Isn't there a potential for an ultimate development that's 4 or 5 times the size of this?
Yes, I believe this is the south end of the proposed future development. It would run up, I believe it lines up with 6th Street, which on your vicinity map along the west side there, up to where the platting stops, I believe is the north boundary of the land. Yeah.
So the potential here is a much greater industrial park. It may or may not ever happen. There are a couple big differences with this subdivision than the one we just discussed, in that I don't see this being I don't see this as being in what I'd call an urban growth area for Dickinson. I don't see it as a primary area for growth. Who knows, but certainly doesn't appear to be that today. The one thing we didn't talk about with the industrial area that we'll be looking at up north is that it does fit with our urban growth plan that was done in '98 or '99. That was not envisioned here, not that we should be bound to that by any means, but there is a difference. So again, I just, if it is approved, I absolutely think it should be annexed. It absolutely needs to be developed with municipal water and sewer and streets that match the development that we're trying to do in Dickinson. But I think we need to take a good hard look at the development itself.
Other comments, questions?
Mr. President.
Mr. Steiner.
I have gone and looked at this land also, and the thing that comes to my mind there is the oil facilities that are there, the pumping units and so on. The thing that comes to my mind is what is the best use of that land? That's what our job is in zoning and rezoning and so on. And, you know, I agree with Mr. Jackson that myself, I don't see any residential going over into that side of one another. best use of that land, to me right now, would be what is being proposed and his future ideas on what is to be proposed there. Again, my concern was the truck route and everything, but that has been established. I don't think the type of commercial industry that he has plans of putting in there are going to be to the high extent of what we may be concerned about. So I don't have any problem with going from the agriculture to the limited industrial on this.
How do you feel about the annexation issue?
That's a tough issue also. I don't believe the property owner at this time is disagreeing with annexation of this and so on. I think he would consider and so on. And I did speak to him a few weeks back, and if it needs to be, I think he would take a good look at it for us.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner. Other comments?
Mr. President, I think that when we look at the development of this land, I think annexation would be important, having it developed to the city standards. And I think if you're going to do a light industrial section like this, really there's no better place that when you look at this area and what is already there, why not have it tucked into a corner of our community where it's workable, but not a distractor from the community as well. I think it's an ideal place for this type of plot. But I think annexing and building it to the standards of the city is going to be important for it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. Other comments?
Mr. President,
Mr. Lamblom?
the zoning district immediately to the west is what?
I believe it's R1, is it R1?
Mobile home.
Mobile homes?
Yes.
And it's undeveloped at this point?
Currently it is.
And how developed is the R2 to the south there in Kitty Corner from?
I believe the majority of that is developed at this point.
Okay. Do we have a responsibility for being sensitive then to that residential area if we're putting in light, was it light industrial? Is there going to be a conflict of uses? Noise, traffic?
Potentially with the industrial being there, there could be some conflicts that go between those zoning districts, certainly.
What is the street number that runs east and west that would border the south side of this, the KLD subdivision?
8th Street.
That's 8th Street. Mr. Jackson and I were down there this afternoon looking at the property. In the short period of time we were down there, there were at least 4 large trucks that came down 8th Street and then turned north and went up that avenue that would that borders the west edge. So I mean, there's truck traffic coming through that residential neighborhood already. I suspect there's going to be more if this land is developed. So, kind of along Mr. Landblom's line of questioning, typically when you're zoning and on one side of the street you have the zoning that accommodates mobile homes. On the next side of the street it would transitioning into limited industrial. I mean, is that typically done, or would you have something else as a buffer before you?
I guess typically we wouldn't see that type of transition. However, there are buffer requirements between the zoning districts that are required. Certainly the road being in there is a big buffer, certainly with the right-of-way widths and things of that nature. There also is a landscaping buffer requirement that's calculated depending on the difference between the 2 zoning types that are you're trying to buffer between. Meaning if you had something like less commercial, might not be as big of a buffer as it would be required for an industrial type development. But there are requirements for that as well.
Okay. Well, with those that commented about not really seeing this particular property being used as residential property, I agree with those comments. I think there are already 3 oil wells over there. We have our stockyards fairly close by. As you go further north, you run into elevators and railroad lines, so it does appear to have more of a commercial or industrial use to it. But it is kind of an abrupt transition from a residential area to an industrial area. And it will mean more truck traffic coming through there.
Yes. We do own that, the mobile home area. That is owned by the city, so, there are some things that may happen on that or could happen that we could control there. One of the big ones that I was looking at today, I guess, in some discussions was there's a lot of lots that, right next to that truck route. I don't know that it would be in our best interest to allow driveways at every one of those lots, and I think there's 20 through this stretch directly across the road. It might be that it might be in our best interest not to sell those lots and allow for a buffer to that truck route just for the residential development, if nothing else. So there is a lot of land there. There is some potentials for some things there if we felt that was important. And when we sell that, someone may come in and ask to rezone some of that too, because it is along that truck route.
That particular piece of land, would we sell that lot by lot, or does it have to be sold as one large parcel?
One large parcel.
Okay.
What's the road surfacing on the south side of the proposed subdivision? Is it aggregate at this point, or is it hardtop?
I believe it's an armor coat or
all the way the whole
to the end of this subdivision, I believe.
Okay.
Other comments? Is there a motion regarding this issue then?
Well, I get a sense that the rest of you are probably more comfortable with this than I am, so I'll let you offer the motion, but I do want to say that this isn't a black and white thing to me either. To me, this is a tough call in this particular situation. It's not a tough call for it to be annexed, in my mind, but the land use is a tougher call than the one we talked about earlier and the north section of town, for me personally. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. My concern over that area is that group home plus those residents that go, that are south and the west of there, as to the disturbance, to a residential area. I have no problem with the annexation part of it either, but I'm just trying to visualize the type of activity, commercial or industrial activity that'll go in there, as it sits in just kitty corner from a residential and a group home area.
If we were to deny this, it begs the question, well then what should the ground be used for?
Absolutely.
I expect we're all asking that question.
Well, especially since that mobile home area has been undeveloped for, well, since beginning of time, and is just sitting there empty anyway.
Sure. Absolutely.
That I can see that the use may have some justification or some rationale in that regard. I'm just trying to widen the scope of this as to where the impacts might show up.
Well, I think that your idea is that we own that land and can create the buffers between there and this industrial section. What other use is this land going to go for if you're looking on down the future? And where else would you rather have this position when you're looking at the map of the greater Dickinson area, and we have a need for this type of development. It's definitely lacking in the greater community. Where would you plug this in at? And I think when I look around, I think plugging it in here makes the most sense.
Well, I think one answer to that, and not to belabor the conversation, but we're just going to be faced with so much of this in the
Right.
coming months. But I think the answer to that is that, you know, to the south, along Highway 22, there is already commercial and industrial development and commercial and industrial zoning. So, you know, in that perfect world, I think I would hope that more development would occur where there is already industrial development, where we're not introducing a new land use. That would be the answer. And I'm, you know, it's anecdotal, but I'm told that we do have a property owner to the south that will be asking for more commercial and industrial development along the Highway 22. So these are tough questions.
This, you know, leads us to another factor that we've talked about, is the trying to prevent, or to cut down on the strip development along our major thoroughfares, and this does take it off the main drag there and consolidates it, and anything to the north between there and the oil wells themselves, you know, becomes prime area for that type of development. Also, are the streets designed for heavy weight limits on 8th Street there?
8th Street and 6th Avenue are designed to DOT standard for load limits.
Other discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Steiner?
I thought the strong part of our argument, well, discussion for this land here was, as Mr. Oltman stated, the best use for that land. And we need that light industrial. And again, you look at the entire city outline there, that to me, I looked at that and that makes sense that that is where we put some limited or light industrial. I do want to caution us on surrounding our community with industrial on it to where our residentials cannot expand also. But again, for this one here, I think it just fits well in there with the road that goes through there, the truck route and so on. And I would make the motion that we do approve the zoning from agricultural to limited industrial.
Well, before you get to the zoning, you know, we have the final plat resolution to deal with, I think, first, Commissioner Steiner. I know we're...
Oh, excuse me, I did jump up there.
We're talking about both issues, which I think is just fine, but, you know, I think the question on the final plat is whether or not you want to approve the resolution without any conditions or with the condition that the property be annexed.
Mr. President, I think we, at least I need to again ask Mr. Colling how we would, it sounds like we have consensus that this should be annexed. If that's the case, how should this be done?
Mr. Jackson, again, I think the easiest time, probably the best time from a planning perspective to annex property in is at the plat development stage.
Yes.
Annex first, rather than hope that you get 75% of the property owners afterwards. It doesn't mean it can't be done the other way, but at least prior to plat approval, you can make annexation happen first as a condition of approval.
So what we would have to do is table the approval of the plat, proceed with the annexation action, and then come back and approve the plat.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Mr.
in
Steiner?
this case, all that land is owned by The one developer, correct?
Correct.
So the 75% is basically
That-
to him.
That's correct, Mr. Steiner. The difficulty is if you approve the plat, and then go forward with the annexation process, any landowner that owns property there would have a statutory right to object to the annexation. Agreements not to oppose annexation are generally void. If the plat is approved, that land could be sold off to other property owners, and other property owners have the right to object. Condition of annex, if I answered your question.
So, I think it may not be unanimous, but I think there is a consensus here that we would like to see the land annexed into the city. And I think there, again, it may not be unanimous, but I think there is a consensus that on first blush, we're in favor of approving the zoning, the rezoning request. Now, by consensus, I'm thinking there's at least 3, possibly 4 votes for that at this stage. Not that you can't change your mind, but.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lamblum.
is it possible when we talk about annexation that we look at a larger land mass than what's being proposed in a subdivision?
Yes, it is. You know, and I think Mr. Jackson and Mr. Soren talked about this briefly, but this is possibly the first phase of a larger development. So I suspect if we're going to have a conversation with the landowner about annexation, you'd probably talk about the larger piece of land. I'm just assuming that that would be the case.
I would agree, but I don't know that it needs to be a requirement. I would think we'd offer that to the developer just to save him time in the future with the annexation question. In other words, I'd be satisfied just annexing this particular parcel for now. But if the developer would like us to take more, great.
The reason I asked is I'd like to avoid leapfrogging or leaving voids in the middle of areas that would be annexed or would not be annexed, and make it contiguous, you know, as kind of on a planning basis. Just more for inquiry.
So, Mr. Cohen, the way I think I'm hearing this, that if we feel strongly about the annexation issue, we probably should just table this resolution and begin discussions with the landowner about annexation and have the city staff do that.
I believe that's correct, Mr. President, yes.
We understand our options? Is the landowner present? Would you like to identify yourself and enter into discussions here?
Sure. My name is Casey Homiston. I'm here representing Bruce Kronk, the developer. I'm with Highlands Engineering. Contrary to what Mr. Steiner said, I don't believe it his desire to annex the property. It's not as cut and dry as it may seem here. The order of magnitude for the construction, if he did annex, is 6-fold. We're talking about possibly $800,000 versus, you know, significantly less dollars if they didn't annex. So that is his desire at the time, or at this time, not to annex.
All right. Any questions for the owner's representative? Okay, thank you. Well, I guess it'd still be my opinion that if we were to allow this, approve this plat, that it should be part of the city. If the owner decides not to go ahead with it, that would be their decision, of course. But,
I agree.
So my recommendation would be a motion then to table and to have the city staff enter into discussions with the owner and see what we can work out.
I would agree.
Would there be a motion to that effect then? Mr. Kessel, did you have a comment?
Again, the same clarification, I assume you're tabling both issues, zoning and?
Well, why don't we just take them separately like we did before? So is there a motion regarding this KLD subdivision final plat?
Mr. President, I'll move we...
Go ahead, Mr. Jackson.
I'll move we table approval of the KLD subdivision final plat and ask staff to enter into discussions with Mr. Crunk.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have the motion and second. Further discussion? No discussion. We'll vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Olmans?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. The motion carries. The next item then would have been or still would be the rezoning petition. And you went through this already, Mr. Soren, but again, would you just tell us what the current zoning is and what the request is?
Sure, President Johnson. The current zoning for the property is agricultural. The request is to go to a limited industrial zoning in the area. The developer with the oil wells that are in there and his plans for future development that best fits his needs. Planning and zoning has reviewed this as well and is recommending approval of the zoning change for this parcel.
Okay. At this time, then, we declare the public hearing open. Is there anyone that wishes to comment regarding this rezoning petition? If so, you can step to the podium, state your name, and we'll hear your comments. Anyone from the public? There's no one from the public that wishes to comment. Would there be any comments, further comments by city staff or city commissioners? Again, your options here are the same as on the previous one, so I don't think we need to go through those again. The chair would certainly entertain a motion regarding the rezoning request.
Mr. Chairman, so the three options are either approve it, disapprove it, or table it until we enter further negotiation or discussions with the developer.
That's correct.
I would move that we table it until we enter into discussions with the current developer.
Okay, we have the motion to the table. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have the motion to second. Is there discussion? No discussion. We'll vote. Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Oltmans?
Aye.
Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. So that motion carries. We'll move back to tab 8, City Administrator's Report.
Thank you, President Johnson. Commissioners, I have two items remaining on the City Administrator's Report. The first is the Old Elks Building update. I've periodically been updating the commission on the progress, construction progress specifically of this building. I did have the opportunity to visit again last week. I would like to report that there is significant progress again. All of the first and second floors are studded out. They are focusing the majority of their attention to these floors. And then there is a third and almost fourth level. Those third and fourth levels, again, are residential in nature. There was progress there as well, but not near the level of progress on the first two. We should see, weather permitting, some work on the outside of the building. He is asking questions regarding the sidewalk detail, and again, the plan is to mirror that of the American Bank Center across the street. He has also asked, and I assume has contacted our city forester about replacing some of the trees that are located along each street and avenue bordering the Elks building. We continue to discuss the issue of land to the north of the Elks Building that is owned currently by Wells Fargo, and the land that the city owns to the west of that for a potential land swap. At this time, there's no progress on those issues, but construction is moving along fairly well. So if there's any specific questions, I'll be happy to try to answer those regarding that building. Hearing none, the next item then is the employee pension plan. You did have two ordinances related to the pension plan. This would be a third. This pension change or ordinance change would affect specifically one area. It is on our defined benefit plan. It affects one form of payment specifically, and that is the lump sum provision. Currently, we allow participants in our defined benefit plan to choose a lump sum payout. That payout is done so in one payment, so it affects the balance of our fund greatly. We are currently at our highest, or at our peak, in terms of eligible employees to retire. So if all of those employees would take the lump sum option, it would significantly impact the balances that we carry in those pension funds. What is proposed, or what we will likely propose at the ensuing meeting, is an ordinance change that would allow, instead of one lump sum payment, it would be 9 annual and equal lump sum, or excuse me, payments. These payments, because they would be extended over a 9-year period, would allow that the benefits paid out to be tax deductible or be rolled over into another another investment option tax-free. If we would extend that to 10 years, that option may not be available to the staff. Hence why we are looking at 9 years instead of 10. We are and have been conducting a great deal of education regarding the retirement benefits over the course of the last few months. This is another education period that we are using to make our employees aware of this potential change. To date, the employee continuum, we have certainly some that like the one payment lump sum option, and we have others that feel that it should be abolished because it jeopardizes the balances, as we've talked about earlier. So we'll continue to educate, but the change that you'll likely see before you is to change a 1 payment lump sum option to a 9 payment lump sum option. So if there's any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer those. If there are none, that would conclude my report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kessel. Item 9 are accounts payable and payroll. Those were emailed to you. Are there any of the payables and payroll that you wish to discuss? Hearing none, would there be a motion to approve accounts payable and payroll?
I'll move.
We have the motion by Mr. Jackson, the second by Mr. Steiner. Any discussion? Hearing none, then we'll vote. Mr. Jackson?
Aye.
Mr. Steiner?
Aye.
Mr. Lamblum?
Aye.
Mr. Olmans?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. The motion carries. Are there any issues by city commissioners? Not. Are there any issues by the public? If there's any member of the public that would like to address the commission, you may do so now. Step to the podium, state your name, and we'll hear your comments. No one from the public, so the chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We have the motion. Is there a second?
Second.